Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're asking whether the media bell tolls for Joe Biden. Also, we're going to take a look at the election numbers for 2024 and examine two hugely important free speech cases in the Supreme Court. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. It's going to be quite the show. Let's get started. Ask not for whom the media bell tolls, Mr. Biden. It times for thee, and those are not the chimes of oranges and lemons ringing out your endorsement. Here we are back on Liberty Nation Radio with our special guest, longtime host of this here radio show and senior political analyst at LibertyNation.com, Mr. Tim Donner, to discuss the breaking of the ranks of the Fourth Estate. Tim, great to have you here.
Okay, always fun, Mark. Appreciate it.
Tim, you wrote a stupendous article of Wednesday this last week discussing the Fourth Estate, almost breaking ranks. And a word you used in the opening there was, it was almost as if the permission seal had been broken, permission concept seal had been broken. And I thought that was really fascinating because it does seem that despite the last, well, since Joe Biden raised his head for the primary, really, he has been treated with kid gloves. And now it looks like there's actually some honest reporting on him from we shan't name them, but the usual suspects. Tim?
Well, I think the relevant single soundbite regarding the media in the 2020 campaign was when Joe Biden came out of one of the rare events that he went and appeared in public afterwards. And they asked him about what flavor ice cream he was indulging in the cone that he had in his hand. That typified the media's coverage of Biden in 2020. See no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil, focus on Trump. And Biden just became the not Trump. And all of his weaknesses, including the ones we're seeing so starkly now, mostly because of his neurological condition. I mean, those were all ignored. Look, Biden's got a 4-year record, and if they were to try and pretend that Biden is popular, that his policies are popular, that people think he can handle another 4 years up to the age of 86, I think they realized that even for them was a bridge too far. So we see stories like the NBC News, which really sort of typified where the media is going. The New York Times were willing to come down hard on the Biden campaign in terms of where it stands, the peril it faces. It's trailing in right now every single battleground state, all 7 of them.
We'll talk about those numbers later on in the show, Tim. Don't give the game away.
You know, Mark, once the big kahunas in Washington and New York, shall we say, the Pied Pipers of left-wing media, of establishment, mainstream, legacy, elite media, however you want to term them, they realize that they can't pretend that everything's all fine with Joe Biden without passing. They wouldn't pass the laugh test. I think they realized they had to at least admit that this guy was unpopular, way behind in the polls, behind in every battleground state. So I think they feel like they have no choice but to acknowledge that the Biden campaign is in deep trouble.
I wonder how much of this is self-serving and whether they're willing to serve their own ends, to essentially sacrifice Joe Biden to serve their own ends. Because two points that I'd like to come back on here. So firstly, you've got this idea that in 2020, yes, he didn't have a presidential record. And so let's be clear what it was. It was fawning. It's sycophantic fawning over Joe Biden as this savior against Donald Trump. It was quite sickening to watch, but it was almost excusable because we already knew their feelings about Donald Trump. And so perhaps ignoring the underlying issues of a Joe Biden presidency, it's almost as though you can see why they might have just sort of skated over it and not paid as much attention as they wanted to. But now it's all out in the open. We've got an almost 4-year record for him to look at, as you pointed out. And you have this situation where if they do it now, then any credibility that they have left, which, let's be very, very clear, is already at an historic low. It's just, yes. Nobody trusts the media anymore because, well, why would they? Let's be fair. So now it's almost like a last stand for them to say, well, okay, before we didn't know what kind of a president he was going to be, but now we know, and therefore we can. Now we know what most Trump supporters believed Biden would be as president. Yeah. I mean, I think people thought that he would be at least a mediocrity who could just kind of lower the temperature, kind of normalize things in terms of sending it back to what people were used to. But I'll never understand how a guy who, if he had just restored normalcy, as he promised to do, and had really attempted to unify, which he said he was going to do, he went in the opposite direction, and that's what's got him in trouble now. Well, let's dig into that a bit, because perhaps part of it, when he was elected in part, and there's no denying it, he was elected in part because he said he was going to be a transition candidate. Nobody expected an 82-year-old or 81, 82-year-old to be on the campaign trail. He said he was a transition candidate time and time again. And the media took that rightly, as did much of the country, to believe that so he's going to serve one term and then his vice president is going to step in, right? So that's what the media was promised. Now, without talking too much about Kamala Harris at the moment.
Implicitly, if not explicitly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe they feel a little bit betrayed because although much of the country, especially according to the polls, she's basically the most unpopular high-level politician in the country who's still in office and staying in office.
Other than Mitch McConnell.
Well, he's leaving. Actually,
but he's leaving.
He's leaving.
He's leaving a leadership position.
Yeah. And so, but the media still love Kamala Harris despite everything. So maybe they feel a little bit betrayed.
Well, I don't think I
shed no tears for them for that betrayal, but
I remember the discussions that we had here in 2021 and 22 when we were talking about whether it was possible for Biden to actually even make it to the end of one term. That the idea was he would be a caretaker president, and then I still can't to this day believe that they thought that Kamala Harris would be a popular successor to him. I mean, I think they did that strictly for political purposes, taking a Black woman. But now look, I've said it so many times, if Joe Biden had, after the midterms, had stepped aside and said, I've done my job, I took down Trump and we did well in the midterms. Now I'll pass it to a new generation. He would have been a hero in the Democratic Party. Now he's going to be a millstone around their neck.
Yeah, or an albatross, perhaps. Don't go anywhere, listeners. We're going to be right back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we have back with us longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, Liberty Nation senior political analyst. Now, in the early part of the show, we were talking about how the media bell is tolling for Joe Biden, but now I want to get really into get into the weeds on this in a good way, Tim, if we may, on the state of play for the 2024 election. Now, before we started recording, Tim, really we kind of veered off into a few different subjects, and it's really a question of what should we keep in what should we keep out rather than what should we keep in, because it's such a huge topic. So I thought maybe I'd give you a free rein here, Tim. What is the most fun, notable, entertaining, captivating, any other adjective you care to throw in there, aspect of the 2024 election for you today?
Maybe perhaps the fact that the media, which has so regretted the fact that they gave Donald Trump all that free media, billions of free media in 2016, they believe they contributed to his election victory, and they've been backpedaling ever since. But now, since this is not really a campaign for votes, it's a campaign for judges and prosecutors who are attempting to decide the election. Now, even though people like Rachel Maddow and other members of the hard left media don't want to give Trump any extra exposure, they have to, because he is filing one motion after another in one court case after another, making statements on courthouse steps one after another. So they're forced to cover him. And every time they do, Mark, I think people are reminded of the fact that for all his bombast and all the liabilities that he's shown over the years, he is being politically persecuted. And I think that's pretty obvious to anyone watching, even the people that aren't inclined to like him. So I think it's amusing that the Democrats wanted to face Donald Trump again in the worst way because they were sure they could beat him again. They beat him once. They were telling themselves they can certainly beat him again. They weren't sure they could beat any other Republican, so they put their foot on the gas, used lawfare to sort of force Republicans to back Trump. And so now they did. Now he's going to be the nominee, and now he is leading in the race, and they are scrambling, and they're desperate because their own strategy has backfired on them. And I will say this. I do believe we've reached the point where the only one who can beat Donald Trump at this point is Donald Trump himself.
Yes, he really is. He's his own worst enemy in many ways. But yeah, I like the point you made there about how he sort of captivated the media attention, because one motion after another, all the court cases, he has to be in the headlines. And I've done a few pieces on the pages of libertynation.com where I examine what kind of coverage that Donald Trump has versus Joe Biden, even before Donald Trump became the presumptive nominee, even before the primaries really kicked off. And he was just a dominant force. It was 2-1 at the very least on pretty much every left-leaning media outlet that he was getting the coverage. It's not so much that he's captivated the media. He's taken the camera and he's holding it right in front of his face, telling the nation that this is happening to me, it can happen to you. And I think that's a lot more powerful than we'll try and build the wall, we'll try and drain the swamp. I think
it's one of the biggest backfires of all time, because it seems to me if they'd left Trump alone, hadn't sued him in 4 different venues, tried to throw him into prison, tried to bankrupt him, they've done it all. They might be well ahead now.
Yeah.
Because they've managed to do something that would seem impossible after January 6, 2021. They've turned Trump into a sympathetic figure. That's pretty hard to do, but the Democrats have managed to do it.
They really have. It's as you say, it might go down as one of the biggest backfires in political history. Now let's talk about the state of the race briefly, Tim. So the latest numbers, I think it's nationally. You did allude to this earlier in the show. I think nationally, Donald Trump's ahead by 2 points. which is, you've made this point time and time again, Tim. In 2016, 2020, he was never ahead by 2 points nationally.
He was never ahead at all.
Yeah.
He was never ahead in the popular vote in the entirety of the 2016 and 2020 elections. Now he's ahead by almost 2 points. So you can do the math.
Yeah.
Especially since, look, both of those elections were decided. 16 and 20 were like mirror images.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The 5 states that Trump won in 2016 narrowly, he lost narrowly in 2020.
Well, that's what I want to get into quickly, Tim, is those states, those swing states, those all important battleground arenas, because the national polling doesn't actually matter so much, because California might have all of these electoral college votes, but they're all going to the Democrat candidate, whoever that happens to be. It's just the battlegrounds that matter, and the polling there shows, well, it's almost overwhelming for Donald Trump, isn't it?
Well, let's put it this way. He is ahead close to or outside the margin of error in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Michigan. Those are the big 5.
That's the electoral college win right there.
And that's it. That's all he needs. That's more than he needs. But he's also ahead in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, albeit narrowly. So the bottom line is that Donald Trump is leading Joe Biden in every single battleground state. I mean, and those numbers, by the way, as you and I often discuss, those numbers get even worse for Joe Biden when you factor in Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who stands a good chance of getting into double digits. And then you factor in left-wing candidates Jill Stein and Cornel West, who will take votes only away from Biden. And the outlook, I mean, frankly, the outlook is grim for Joe Biden, which is why I say I think only Donald Trump can beat himself at this point.
It's very good. There's a 7.5 month gap in which Donald Trump can start letting out the rope with which to hang his campaign. And
yes, that's right.
So yeah, I think you're right that he's really the only one that can beat him. One final question for you, Tim. Do you think that there will be much movement in these polls if Donald Trump is convicted of one or more crimes?
I think there will be some. I think it's unavoidable for there to be some impact. I think the one that people will pay attention to are the federal charges related to the so-called insurrection. That's the one that I think people most know and have opinions about. But I think in totality, it's not going to be enough to turn around the current trends in the election, because January 6th is the most well-chronicled event of the 21st century, and everybody has already baked in their own opinion on it, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anybody who's really not voting for Donald Trump because of January 6th are not responding to these polls saying that they're voting for Donald Trump. That's a fascinating point. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much for being here. Really appreciate you. See you soon.
Look forward to it, Mark. Thanks so much.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. On our special Talking Liberty segment, we are once again joined by Liberty Nation regular, Mr. Scott D. Cassenda, who also happens to be Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor. Scott, thanks for coming back in.
Thank you, Mark.
So, Scott, this week the big news had to be the Biden case in the Supreme Court. Now, for me, this was an important one because it's an actual real-life example of a First Amendment case. And there are so many First Amendment cases that they're tangential to the First Amendment, or they have implications to the First Amendment. But for me, this was really just, hey, that's a First Amendment case. Could you give us the details on that?
I will tell you that I don't know that all the justices are going to agree with you that it is.
If I may just interrupt your introduction on this, Scott. you and I were listening in to the Supreme Court's arguments on this,
Indeed.
and I believe I think I messaged you saying I'm quite proud, something along the lines of I don't mean to brag, but I believe I actually know more about the First Amendment
Right.
than at least one of the Supreme Court justices,
Yeah.
which pleased me no end, Scott. You can tell me if I was wrong in my assessment of my own understanding, but
Well,
please do give us the
let's
details of the
unpack the
case.
issues a bit here. The Biden administration conducted what I think is fair to say is a full-on assault against the opinions of many Americans who they disagreed with on social media platforms. This includes Facebook, Instagram, all the popular ones, where there were up to and including like dozens of phone calls from literally within the White House, people screaming and cursing at executives, wondering why they haven't taken posts down or what they're doing to control posts.
Let's just to be clear, these posts were largely concerning COVID-19, things like
Vaccine
that, right?
skepticism, I think,
Yeah.
is broadly speaking what we're talking about, Mark, and messages that the White House didn't approve of. That's the key takeaway, is that this was speech that the White House found terribly inconvenient and didn't want to be able to, they wanted to muzzle people. And so what did they do? Well, they can't arrest people yet anyway in America for these opinions alone. So they went to basically Facebook and said, put them in Facebook jail or kick them off your platform. And the attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana, at least, and several other individuals sued and said, hey, this is an imposition on my free speech rights. The government is essentially, using their levers against these companies to punish my speech, which is in effect making them an arm of the government in the suppression of my speech.
So that really is this thing. So we hear so much about when people claim that my free speech rights are being trampled upon. Most recently, I think the big high profile one would be Mr. Don Lemon, who said that Elon Musk was trampling on his free speech rights by not paying him to produce content. However, he was obviously letting one thing.
Tesla, I think, too, right? Part of the payment. Yeah.
Yes.
New Tesla, I think, was.
Well, why not, right? Why not? Yeah. But that clearly is not a First Amendment issue.
No, that's preposterous.
But this actually is a First Amendment, because the First Amendment is not designed to limit individual speech.
It is a First Amendment issue in terms of the analysis we have to go through to discuss whether it's a First Amendment issue. So the question is whether it's coercive, meaning if the recipient of those messages at Facebook, for instance, there were many recipients, but by and large, if they didn't take the information in to be a threat, for instance, if they thought they had every ability to refuse such a request without negative government action befalling them, then it wouldn't be a threat. And there's some evidence to suggest that they did feel comfortable rejecting certain claims or certain, efforts by administration officials. Now, I'll hasten to add, this is pervasive throughout the administration. So it's not like there were a few officials. There were many officials in many agencies who did this all the time. It was a full-on assault by all these administration actors. And so how any individual recipient of those messages felt would be an important part of the analysis as to whether or not it was violative of the First Amendment.
I think that really is an important point. Did people feel coerced into taking down things? And that's the crux of the matter.
Yes,
that is very much the crux.
And it's not the Facebook account holder who about their feeling about it. It's the Facebook executive that received the communication, right?
Yeah. Now, there's a couple of things. If I were arguing against the Biden administration here, the point that I would make is that if you have records of people screaming and cursing at the executives, which they do, I would say that certainly did intend to be coercive, whether or not the individual on the receiving end of the screaming and the cursing felt under pressure or not. I think that's a key point, because it certainly seems that it was intended to be coercive, because you don't swear and curse at somebody if you're asking them how their day is.
Let me play the devil's advocate with you, Mark.
Please.
Let's, instead of talking about a subject matter that perhaps you don't have a charitable view of the administration position on. Okay, let's change it to one where you do have a charitable view of the administration position. And let's say, so Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in the argument said, what if there's this new social media trend where kids are jumping out of windows at ever higher heights? And the administration wants to say, hey, stop allowing these kids to post these videos where they're getting hurt and encouraging other people maybe to get hurt. This is a message of whether we agree that the platform should remove those messages or not, or that the government should ask them to remove them. We can all agree that we don't want kids to be hurt playing some stupid prank game that they're not smart enough, I guess, to figure out they shouldn't engage in the first place, right? So with that kind of a message, Mark, is it an imposition on their free speech, or is it somebody who is just a concerned member of society who's in a position of leadership arguing to another leader in our society of these communication platforms, hey, we're trying to have a society here where people don't get injured, and what you're doing is hurting the cause.
Well, let me respond, Counselor, on that one. So if I were going against that particular argument, which, as you say, was made by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, I would suggest that who's the person that determines what is injurious to society? Because yes, although it seems very, very clear that jumping out of a high window is injurious, if you allow exceptions, as for example, well, there's an exception here, who gets to determine what the exceptions are? And then it becomes a question of, there's a regulator now of your, in this instance, speech, what you're doing. Sure. And I think that was actually the point you were getting to, wasn't it, Scott?
Well, there's
did I just jump all over your point there?
Maybe the Darwin Award people would have something to say about their lack of contestants if these sorts of things get shut down right away. Well, there's another, if we're going to talk about Ketanji Brown Jackson's performance at the court, one of the things we should mention, I think, Mark, is how she, after positing that very hypothetical, seemed beside herself. Well, maybe that's a bit rich, but in any case, quite concerned that the view of the of the free speech that the advocates had made it so the government couldn't ban that speech. And she suggested that some people would think the government had a duty to ban that speech, somehow to instill some, safety measure for Americans, which, of course, has never been a feature of our Constitution or our Bill of Rights. And in fact, those people, I think, would think it would render it worthless if there could be all these exceptions. It's going to help children. So here's an exception to this rule, and here's an exception to that one.
I'm going to do an interjection, but I'm going to try and do it in my narrator voice.
Yes.
It was at this point, whilst Mark was watching the Supreme Court proceedings, that he determined he had a greater knowledge of the First Amendment than one of the court justices.
Yeah.
All right, that's my narration voice, if you ever hear it again.
What I hear is I think it's from The Simpsons, won't somebody please think of the children interjection, which would literally render anything you want to do, you kind of moot in terms of comparison to a NERF society where we're all having to drive around in bumper cars, I guess.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's always, and fans of Always Sunny in Philadelphia will appreciate this, it's always about the implication, isn't it? Yeah. So if we take the implied meaning that, well, we can circumvent or we can give the government this power because of this situation, well, the implication is that there'll be other situations where the government will make use of that power.
I wonder how Ketanji Brown Jackson is going to feel about the emergency Donald Trump fines if he's reelected to the presidency. There will certainly be other presidents who have emergencies that perhaps she doesn't approve of.
Yes.
Like, the border, like we have a crisis at the border, and maybe posts encouraging people to cross at the southern border should be banned, and Facebook, should be compelled to enforce the administration will with respect to that. It doesn't take long to think of all manner of restrictions that would be easily and eagerly imposed by those if they were given the keys to the exceptions to the rule.
As the great British polemicist and YouTuber Paul Joseph Watson often likes to point out, it's okay when we do it. Scott, we'll be right back with Scott Cosenza after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Earlier in the show, we were talking about the recent free speech case up at the Supreme Court. But now there's actually more Supreme Court cases, Scott. And it really tis the season, I think.
More free speech cases.
More free speech cases. Tis the season. I'm chucking an apostrophe in there and getting rid of a vowel. Tis the season for Supreme Court cases, Scott. So also on the same day that it was, let me get this right, it wasn't, we've just been talking about Murty versus Missouri, but it was originally Missouri versus Biden. But that wasn't the only case at the Supreme Court on that day. That was Monday last week. There was also a case that involved, of all things, the National Rifle Association, but it was a free speech case, not a Second Amendment one. Scott, tell me the details.
Mark, just like how President Donald Trump is being prosecuted criminally in federal court and being prosecuted criminally in state court, okay?
Scott, if they had another court, they'd prosecute him in that too.
Well, and also the...
I believe there's some koalas with a court, or kangaroos, or other marsupials. Take your pick.
Also, the progressives in the form of... also, the federal government discriminated against conservative speech, but that's not by itself the threats that they face, Mark. State actors want to get in on that action as well. And Kathy Hochul and her regulator, Mr. Vullo, also discriminated against conservative speech. In this form was against the NRA specifically. The National Rifle Association, like so many other organizations with large amounts of people, exploits their membership for their financial gain through the form of selling them insurance policies, probably vehicle protection, any number of things where having just a mass of people you can mail to, generates profits, basically.
Information and data, that's the product, right?
So what happened was the governor of New York and her appointees didn't like the messages that the NRA were sending about gun control, and so they decided to simply use their power as government officials to shut them down by leveraging the banks and other financial institutions that they regulate. Sort of like, hey, I know you want this approval on Tuesday for the new branch that you're going to open. Did you know that you're sponsoring this speech by processing the NRA, like credit card transactions, or allowing them to do business in your state? You might want to revisit that. And so they did what anybody who wants to stay in business would do if the king doesn't, like that you're friends with person X. Well, maybe it's a good idea not to be friends with person X. And that's what happened. They discriminated against the NRA then. The banks said, we don't want your business. We won't take it. We refuse to, because we're afraid of the consequences that the state government is going to visit upon us by doing business with you.
So this case, Scott, what is the question that the Supreme Court is trying to answer?
Mark, this is a First Amendment case. The question is, did the governor and her actors, her appointees, violate the free speech rights of Americans and the NRA? Because don't forget, the NRA has the right to make their speech, right? And we have the right to hear it.
Yeah.
So it's both. Now, the NRA is the one who's suing. There aren't just like random plaintiffs suing for the right to have heard the NRA, but those are the twin issues that will be examined. Did they impermissibly coerce these banks and financial institutions because of the NRA messaging?
That we tend to keep finding this word coerce and coercion and various other forms of the word coercive, and it seems that so let's tie these two cases together. We had on the same day we had the Biden Missouri case, or Murty Missouri case, and now we've got the NRA against. Actually, who's the other plaintiff? That New York, the state of New York.
NRA v. Vullo. Vullo is the name of an administrator from the state of New York.
And in both cases, the accusation is that the government used its power to apply pressure in such a manner that it's and I keep coming back to this whenever we talk about this. I always come back to this thing. It's a couple of dime store thugs that are going around saying, hey, that's a nice company you got there. That's a nice business you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it.
Yeah.
So, is there any other way to look at this? Give me the other side on this.
Justice Brett Kavanaugh asked one of the advocates, and it's funny, I listened to both cases yesterday a couple times. I can't remember which one it was, but in any case, the definition is important for both of them. What coercion was in the threat had to be of the or else, and it is just adverse government action, meaning it's not I'm going to scream and yell at you, or I'm going to scream and yell at you again tomorrow. It is some negative government action is going to befall you, whether I delay your application for some important thing or deny it, meaning like any adverse action that way would trigger the coercive element to these tests.
Now, Scott, we're obviously not going to get a ruling on this until June, July time when the term ends. But do you have any indication of which way you think? I mean, I think we all know where Justice Ketanji is going to fall on this one. But regarding the Biden, Missouri one, the Murty, Missouri case, do you think
let's take the NRA fake case first, Mark, and say that the common wisdom seemed to be that the justices were inclined to rule that the NRA will be victorious, that they had their free speech rights violated by New York officials. I tend to think so too, based on the evidence presented and the tone of the question.
Well, let's dig into that just ever so quickly. So there were questions asked by the justices that were compelling to you to make them think that they will rule in favor of the NRA. What is the remedy to make the NRA whole again? Because
it'll be money damages. If it goes as I imagine it might, they will rule that the state imposed unconstitutionally on the First Amendment rights of the NRA. They'll order them to not do that, and then they'll usually in a case like this, they would actually send it down to the lower courts for a damages assessment. The Supreme Court doesn't get involved in that. They send it back down, and then there will be a damage assessment made. And the taxpayers of the state of New York, in addition to funding Kathy Hochul's generous salary and pension, will also fund the damage award to the NRA.
I think that's something that people overlook so often, is that when people abuse their power, especially this is very true at state level and to some degree at federal, when they abuse their powers and they get sued, which they invariably do in these situations, and they end up paying out. That's less schools for your kids. That's more potholes in your street. That's less rubbish pickups because your elected officials chose instead of dealing with the day-to-day issues, they decided to posture and follow some ideological madness.
This is why eternal vigilance is the price of freedom, and we have to be vigilant against these prosecutors, no matter where on the ideological spectrum they are. There are a number of deep red state prosecutors that are trying to, make a case about whether it's abortion or any other number of things, and the place for society to work out its dramatic policy differences is in the legislature, not in the courts. And the solutions that come out of the courts are inelegant and don't really work very well. So,
naturally, right? They're not deliberative positions. That's what your legislatures are for. We've only got a few seconds left on this. Can you give us your roundup on how you think the First Amendment case, Biden, Missouri, will go?
I think they're going to use some procedural grounds to avoid ruling on it. Unlike the NRA case, the threats are extremely specific against an extremely specific group. The generalized nature of the concerns are going to argue against. And this is just a preliminary injunction ruling, by the way. The case in chief is still in the lower court, so there's plenty of room for more evidence to be developed. But for the injunction that's in place now, I wouldn't be surprised if there were 5 votes to lift it.
Scott, thanks ever so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to just take a moment to thank our special guests today, Tim Donner and Scott Cosenza, and of course you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to join us each and every week. You are appreciated. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.